So we're continuing our discussion out of Chapter 1, and essentially what we're doing in this unit is just giving a really broad overview of all the pieces of legislation that impact payroll. So just as a sort of a quick review, I think I maybe got 8 or 9 slides deep. Let's just see how much you remember from Tuesday. Anybody remember what FICA is? Without looking. This is just a off the top of your head, do you remember these things question? Yeah. And even if you don't remember what it stands for, do you remember what it is? Yeah, it is. It's Federal Insurance Contributions Act. And there's 2 taxes under it, right? And you hit one of them, Social Security and health insurance / Medicare. Good, great job. Yep. So that's obviously a very sweeping piece of legislation. And then we had a little trip down historical alley. What just happened there?
You said healthcare and what? Social Security.
Sorry, I'm sure this is wigging out on me here. I'm not sure what all these. How did I just get those in there? That's all review, and it's all in here. Yeah, I'm just seeing like how much do you remember off the top of your head? How many pieces of unemployment tax legislation was there? 2. Anybody remember what they're called? FUTA and SUTA, right? Federal unemployment, state unemployment. What rough era were all of these acts passed in? No, that was another really big piece of legislation was passed in 64. This is going all the way back to the New Deal. The 30s. I think it was passed in 38 as part of FDR's New Deal, right? And we did talk about a really pivotal piece of legislation that was passed in 1964, which we all know is what? The Civil Rights Act, right? And who signed that again? Johnson, right? Kennedy crafted it and was assassinated before it could be signed into law. So LBJ's name is on it. And it prohibits what kinds of things? Discrimination in
race,
religion, national origin, gender. What did we say? Race, national origin, color, religion, and gender. Yep. It didn't protect things like ageism. It didn't protect disability against discrimination against sexual orientation. It didn't protect discrimination based on disability. All of those categories of anti-discrimination laws followed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and some of them not for decades, frankly. We still don't have federal law around sexual orientation. It's state by state. It's state law, right? So we're going to look at a couple of those subsequent laws, and I think that's where I left off was at the ADEA, right? Age discrimination.
Yeah.
Right here. Age Discrimination in Employment Act, and I think we talked about this being added 3 years later. In 67, LBJ was still president. I don't believe that Nixon was elected until November of 68. So he obviously, LBJ also signed this. So ADEA said you can't discriminate, and it's 4 things: hiring, firing, promoting, and compensating, right? Hiring, firing, promoting, and compensating. So basic employment practices. You can't discriminate based on age. But then we talked about there's a couple caveats, and we're going to see these over and over and over in the laws. So this one, applies to employers engaged in interstate commerce with 20 or more workers. So it doesn't apply to a small mom and pop that isn't engaged in interstate commerce. What is that? Yeah, it's commerce, i.e. goods and services, well, goods crossing state lines, either raw materials, final products, whatever, right? Subcomponents. So if you're a small mom and pop and you pick cherries up in the Flathead and you sell them to people on the side of the road, right, in Flathead Valley, you're not engaged in interstate commerce, you don't have 20 or more employees, you really don't have to comply with this law. So just be aware as we watch for this as we see more and more of these laws, that they're not universally applicable. A lot of them have these caveats. And I think I talked about that on Tuesday. Anybody remember why I said that? I mean, why does it flush out like that? Through what process? Anybody remember? How are laws made? All of a sudden you're in a poli-sci class.
Legislation?
Yeah. How does it start? Where do they start? Do they start on the floor of the House?
The bill on Capitol Hill.
They start on a bill in a committee, right? So this probably came through a Department of Labor committee, right? DOL committee. And you have hearings, and people discuss them. It always starts on the House, right? House of Representatives. And there's a lot of compromise, pros and cons, back and forth, right? And then the bill reaches the House floor, and they vote on it, right? Then it has to go where? It has to go to the Senate. Then it's going to be rehashed in the Senate. It's going to go through a whole series of committees and more hearings, right? And so what emerges oftentimes as a piece of law, isn't it all what it looked like when it was introduced 6 months or a couple years prior, whatever, right? Because that's just the legislative compromise, right? And now, of course, in our political system, we have this whole spool or whole body of people that aren't elected but are paid, called lobbyists, that do a lot more to craft our laws than most of us want to admit. Okay. So when you see things like this was the impact probably of combination of external lobbyists and compromise. Like, I don't want it to have to apply to small businesses. I'll sign on to this, but you can't make it apply to small businesses. And then it basically protects anybody over 40, except for a couple caveats. Like if you're employed in something in a profession like a medical doctor or an airplane pilot, or you're running a merchant marine ship, you're skipper of a merchant marine ship, you clearly, age is critical. Or you hold a senior CEO position and you're guaranteed a good pension anyways. They're not going to discriminate, they're not going to hold you to discrimination based on ageism in those positions. So those are the caveats. What does this last little bullet mean? Places the onus on the employer to keep accurate payroll and personnel records. Yeah, it's their responsibility. ADA. 1990, who was president? I've got to think about that for a second. Yeah, it was Bush Sr. Bush Sr., right? 88 through 92. Clinton was elected in 92 and 96. So ADA, a whole bunch of you probably weren't even alive, but it was, I remember very graphically, I was only 3 when the Civil Rights Act of '64 was passed, but I was in grad school when this was passed. And it was really poignant. There was still, there was no federal law protecting discrimination against folks with disabilities. And the protests on Capitol Hill were so poignant because there were massive amounts of people that came in and took themselves out of their wheelchairs, and then people pulled their chairs away, and they were just all over the Capitol grounds. They were all over the Senate buildings. And it was really graphically poignant, and it pressured Congress to take action on it. What came out of it was ADA. Most of you, your whole lifetimes, have only, you've just known that as a concrete fact, right? You've got to have access to bathrooms. You've got to have elevators. You've got to make workplaces accessible. You've got to make public buildings accessible. But forever, that wasn't so. Okay. What came out of it was a law that's got really ambiguous, and I'm going to try and paint a little bit of a picture how that came about and what the problem is with that ambiguity. So basically it says three things. Let's go through that first. And again, right here, first line, only employers with 15 or more employees. So it doesn't apply to everybody. Okay? You cannot discriminate against a qualified person based upon his or her disability. Okay, so somebody that's adequately educated and capable of performing a job. But right here is where the language gets crazy, a little crazy. With or without reasonable accommodation. And we're going to talk about that in a second. Second, this applies to applying, hiring, firing, terminating, compensating, training, all the things that we've talked about before, all aspects of an employment relationship. And now we're going to take a little bit of a more thorough look at what reasonable accommodation is. So let me just paint a picture. Do you think it's reasonable if a professor applies at Missoula College and she or he is in a wheelchair and they're the most qualified applicant for a chemistry professor job? Do you think it's reasonable to expect the University of Montana to accommodate him or her?
Yes.
Why?
Because they hired him.
One more time.
Because they hired him in the first place.
Well, so I'm considering the four of you, and one of you are in a wheelchair, and that person happens to be the most qualified. The question is it reasonable to accommodate him or her?
Yeah.
If you're the University of Montana.
Yeah.
We're a $500 million a year entity. We've got, we're an educational institution where you're trying to obviously set an example of equal opportunity, and we've got resources, right? So clearly, okay, what if he or she's blind?
It's still.
Now what additional, so a wheelchair is a quote unquote easy example for many of us to picture, right? You've got to have wide enough doors, you've got to have access to offices, bathrooms, classrooms, etc. But really, aside from, you've got to be able to, reach the board and maybe bring some workstations down. But it's not tough to imagine how that would work. Now, what happens if someone's blind? What kinds of things do you have to accommodate?
You still got your resources, you just have to change them a little bit.
You've got to have, recognition software. You may have to have I don't know, I'm just making this up, 15-hour-a-week TA, right, that's dedicated to that professor. It's going to be more extensive, isn't it, clearly, right? But you can still make the case at an educational institution with a wide, vast swath of resources that accommodation would be reasonable if he or she was the most qualified person, right? Okay, now take that whole example and your open road cyclery down here on Orange Street. You've got 15 employees. You're a bike repair shop. You sell bikes. Is it reasonable? And I don't know if you've ever been in there, but it's a really small. Anybody ever been in there? Yeah, it's a small shop. Everything's pretty crammed into a pretty small space. Is it reasonable to expect them to accommodate somebody in a wheelchair?
No.
Why not?
They're a small business, they can't afford to get a whole new building just for one employee.
Okay, but I don't think you need a whole new building. I think that you need to retrofit your doors and your restroom. And I'm the person in the wheelchair that wants the job. And I've got this law behind me, and I've got an attorney.
You'd have to go out to your resources and get some help.
You see where I'm already going with this? This terminology, reasonable accommodation, has just flooded the courts since the day ADA passed, almost 30 years ago now, 30 years, I guess, to the day. 30 years ago, it has just flooded the courts. I personally had an example with this right after it was passed. I was CFO of a biotechnology company in northern Colorado, and we were a really small shop, 21, 22 employees, and we were doing research and development and trying to bring a drug to market for bovine and equine, for animals, large animals. So it was a biological pharmaceutical company, and we had our own lab, right? And in our lab we had chemists and microbiologists. And the lab stations were standing stations, right? So everything, whatever that height is, 40 inches maybe, right? And I mean, everything from, we had a wet lab, right, where you've got it all plumbed in, and then you've got the eye washes, and I mean, just everything was set at this level. And we interviewed for a microbiologist, and one of the gals that was applying that was in the final list was in a wheelchair. Reasonable accommodation would have meant building a whole nother station, you know, at wheelchair level, and or building or buying or somehow figuring out how to get in mobile ramps so that she could move between the workstations. Okay, we're a startup company. When you're in startup mode in a pharmaceutical company, all you're doing is spending money, right? Because you don't get approval to the FDA, you can't generate any revenue. So it's called your burn rate. How much money are you going through on a monthly basis? Our burn rate was about 60 grand a month. And everything was just based on we needed to get FDA approval and get that product launched, or I mean, game over, right? It was funded by a veterinarian from the UK who had sold his business in the UK, moved to northern Colorado, started this, his whole life's work was in this. Reasonable for us to do it, yay or nay? See where I'm going with this? It's just, she actually chose to retract her application when she saw the lab, and I think understood. There were a lot of big labs in northern Colorado at the time, and a lot of places that had the ability to accommodate. So at any rate, without belaboring the point, this piece of legislation is, and I'm super surprised it hasn't been amended or modified or just sort of re-upped. It hasn't. It still stands as it did 30 years ago, and it's still really vague and subject to court interpretation. Okay, this one's got a big old long name, Federal Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996, signed into law by 96. You guys were all alive then. You weren't alive then. Bill Clinton. Yeah. Yep. And most of us know this very long title by its sort of layperson's name, which is welfare reform. And again, a lot of you are too young to remember this, but prior to 1996, there was a lot of national conversation about, I don't even know how to describe it, intergenerational welfare. In other words, we were on our second and sometimes even third generation of families where nobody had ever worked. And they really didn't know anybody that worked. And you just went to the mailbox and got a check. And as you can imagine, there was, public outcry at some point, like, this is not healthy, either economically or societally, right? So welfare reform was really one of Clinton's linchpin pieces of legislation. And it's a really, really long law. It's like 2,200 pages. I think it's even longer than Obamacare as far as just voluminous law. And there's tons and tons and tons of different caveats, but the one that applies to us and that we're going to be working with is around this idea of having a national registry for this guy. Got two mice up here. Mouses. OCSE, the Office of Child Support Enforcement. And as you can imagine, this isn't earth-shattering. But what the findings before this law was instituted or written, there was tons of research done on why do we have intergenerational welfare and what are the impediments to having a healthy, productive life. And what we found is that there was a large amount of people living in poverty, again, this is not particularly profound, were single mothers that didn't have support from their ex-partners, right? So, and before this law, if you wanted to get out from underneath child support, all you had to do was cross state lines. There was no interstate cross-check, okay? And that changed this. It made a national registry so that if your spouse or partner, man or woman, owes money in child support and they're like, screw it, I don't want to pay, and they leave Montana and move to Vermont, the minute they start working in Vermont and their social security number is entered into this mainframe system of OCSE, they're going to be tagged and flagged, and the wages are going to be garnished. And Vermont's going to be sending the money to Montana to distribute to the parent that has the children, right?
Before they could just evade.
They just totally, and you can't believe, I remember again, I was in my mid-30s, I was a young mom myself at the time, and the cases that came out, and it's not just like, it's not just like low and middle income parents that did this. I mean, these people came out like these super, super wealthy, like plastic surgeons and oral surgeons and attorneys who had left Nevada and moved to California and had these multi-million-dollar practices to get out, but they wouldn't pay, $300 a week in child support. So there's really a national outcry around it. What we're going to do as payroll processors is we have an obligation when we bring somebody into our company to fill out something called a new hire reporting form, and that's how we get their information into the system for the cross-check. So of this huge piece of legislation, most of it doesn't involve us in payroll per se, but this does, and this falls to payroll processors to comply with. And it's one of those lovely pieces of federal law that actually do what it said it was going to do, and has decreased the amount of people that are non-compliant. Okay, IRCA. 1986, who was president? And this just totally makes sense. Who was the conservative president in the 80s? Reagan. Signed into law IRCA, Immigration Reform and Control Act. Prior to 1986, and again, this is probably hard for many of you to imagine, I was just graduating college, undergrad in 1986. There was no laws against people coming to work in this country from other countries. There really weren't green cards. There weren't immigration laws. It's kind of a non-issue. In 1986, Reagan passed this act, which bars or prohibits hiring or retaining anybody that's not authorized to work in the United States. And the mechanism, most of you, your whole work lives, obviously one of the first things you fill out when you go in the door, right, is an I-9, right? And it shows that you're either a U.S. citizen, a passport, or I think if you have a driver's license, you have to show something else too, don't you? What else? Like your voter's card or social security card. This is just a little aside for any of you that travel and don't know this. You have to have those new travel cards by October to get on a plane in this country.
Yeah, that's crazy.
And I would not be waiting until September to do it. I have got it on my list to get done in the next month. You can't use your passport. It has to be on your driver's license, is my understanding.
No, you said you can use your passport, but I just got my driver's license.
Yeah.
That was like last month, and you said we can use your passport.
So if you have a passport, you don't have to get the card?
You don't have to get it. That is true. Yes.
That is true. Okay, that was not my understanding. Thank you for sharing that. I'm sure you know.
Yeah.
Okay.
Federal ID cards are also an exemption to that. If you work for a government agency, you have
I see. Okay. Federal ID card.
yeah.
Then you don't have to get a...
Then you can use that instead of
Okay.
that.
So it's for folks that don't have a passport because they don't travel internationally. And they don't work for the government, but they do want to fly within the country.
That's right.
Okay. Good to know. And you get that with TSA?
Because it's kind of the same process for each one of those. You have to provide the same sort of information and verification
Okay. Good to
of
know.
who you are,
Okay.
which I had to go back twice when I just got my real ID. Well, I did it a while ago, but you really want to look at that list of what...
Of what you... Yeah, because, I don't know.
I didn't
How many
have
people
it.
have their original Social Security card? Really? Golly, you guys keep way better track of your records than I do. So I've got my kids' Social Security cards, but my own? Are you kidding?
Yeah, my some other state and she was trying to leave, but because it didn't have like a star on it for like their state, they were like, this isn't real, like you can't use this.
No
Yeah,
kidding.
it wasn't
It's
like
really,
like what it looks like, how every ID is kind of different. Like they were looking for specific things.
and is it an anti-terrorism measure or generally, or does anybody know why we're upping
I
the,
think that's the theory.
okay.
I thought it was because they wanted them all to be the same, but if there's like the stars or like different things, that doesn't make sense.
Okay, well, at any rate, if that describes you, you should probably look into it. I've got a passport, so I guess I'm okay. But so I-9s, that's the first thing you do when you go in, right? You fill out what 2 documents when you go to work? W-4 and I-9. It shows that you're eligible and that you're eligible to work in the United States. And then the employer signs it. What do they do with it? Do they have to send it to somebody, or do they just keep it?
We have to send it to the,
No, they just hold on to it. But you can be audited. They can come in and audit your I-9s, and that happens all the time in in industries, in areas like, meat packing in Iowa, for example, or in places where there's a lot of propensity to maybe not have all your ducks in a row with who you're hiring. They will come in and do audits of I-9s, and there's pretty hefty penalties if you're not compliant. And then this is new, this last bullet, E-Verify. I haven't myself, I'm not familiar with it, but it allows an employer to go in and cross-check Social Security numbers. Okay, you're not required to do it, but it's an extra precautionary step. There is a huge black market in this country, as you can imagine, for Social Security numbers of dead people. I mean, they cost, from what I understand, a couple grand. And, it's very, if you got a couple grand, it's evidently very, and somebody that's in the black market, I wouldn't really know where to go, but it's evidently really easy to do. So this is a kind of an extra step that you might do to protect yourself as an employer, but you don't have to. FMLA. This was also signed, this was another one of Clinton's Lynchstone. Actually, this was his first big piece of legislation. He was hired in '92, and he worked on this. This is also probably hard for many of you to believe that this ever didn't exist, but certainly in my lifetime, and I've got a really good example how it protected me that I'll give you in just a second. So it only covers, again, here's the compromise caveat, if you have to have 50 or more employees within a 75-mile radius to be covered. So obviously at the university we have FMLA, but if you're some small shop, Big Dipper ice cream isn't covered by FMLA because they don't have 50 employees, right? And what it says is that you get 12 weeks of unpaid leave for birth, death, or care of spouse, kids, or lineal family members, parents, kids, things like that, okay? It's hard to imagine, but prior to this, if I needed to take time off, my spouse was going through chemotherapy, and I needed to be with him or take care of a sick kid, my boss could say, you're out, you're done, you don't get to work here anymore. Right? We had no protection for that. The way this law was, it doesn't need to be used consecutively. So if I've got a kiddo that's going through cancer care and she's sick 2 days a week, it doesn't have to be 12 consecutive weeks. I can take off every Monday and Tuesday to care for her. Within 1 year's time, within 52 weeks, but it's a rolling 52 weeks. Now, obviously from an employee standpoint, this is a huge benefit. From an employer's standpoint, it can also be kind of tough. So I run an accounting department and you're my accounts payable clerk, and all of a sudden you're gone 2 days a week. Well, guess what I'm doing every weekend now? Your work 2 days a week. So I've seen it from both sides. Clearly, it's a huge benefit to employees to allow them to deal with life issues. They've got to maintain your health care coverage. And if you are off for the consecutive time, say 6, 7, 8, 9 weeks, you have to have the ability to return to the same job. Okay. So the way this piece of legislation was originally written was for paid leave. That's the other thing. How many among us can take off, reduce our paychecks by 40% overnight, right? I'm not getting paid for 2 days a week. I mean, I wouldn't make, my family budget wouldn't last very long doing that. So, it was written as paid leave. As you can imagine, there was an extremely strong lobby that pushed back against this, small business lobby. Any idea where America falls into the whole global spectrum of giving paid leave? Very, very low. Very low. In Scandinavia, for example, I lived in Copenhagen, Denmark for 2 years when I graduated from undergrad, and you get 1 year paid leave to have a child. And they've done and I mean, the numbers are so obvious. All of the statistical research on it. Less juvenile delinquency, less, just less dysfunction and upheaval in the family. I mean, just all the things you can imagine if any of us are given the opportunity to spend the first year with our child and kind of get past the postpartum and get everything together and get our households organized, right? And then you come back to the workforce. And they've shown over and over and over how that's so much more financially reasonable. But, I mean, we couldn't even get 12 weeks paid leave here. Okay. Some states give paid leave, though. I think there's 3 or 4. I know California is one of them. Delaware is one of them. The liberal states, as you would imagine, have paid leave from the state coffers. With that said, money doesn't grow on trees. That comes from taxes, right? Okay. FMLA. Oh, so the example I was going to give you is I got hired here in 1995. I got hired in spring of 94. Started fall of 95. And I hadn't been here 8 weeks. We got a call that my father was essentially needed critical care he was dying of cancer. And I had to tell him, after I only talked here for 8 weeks, I need to take like a couple months off. I mean, his wife had just died. Nobody else lived in California, blah, 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 blah. I don't want to hear the whole story. But I took my 3-year-old with me and went down there for 2 months. And I mean, honestly, I would have lost my job if it had been 2 years earlier. Who's going to hold on to somebody that's only taught for 8 weeks? And then you're like, bye, I got to split for 2 months. Right? But it protected me. Okay, ERISA. This, what time do we go to again? 12:30 to 1:50? No, to 1:50. Yeah, okay, and I want to, 2 minutes. Okay, so ERISA was passed in 1974. Anybody know who was president then? Guess. We just expanded into Cambodia and Laos with it was Nixon. Yeah, bombing campaign, Vietnam. This was also the beginning of the slide and the loss of manufacturing jobs in America. When I was a little kid, everything was made in America. Cars, tools, machines, plates, sheets, desks. I mean, and it was about this time, about when I was entering high school, that you saw the first Sony television. And for the first time, we heard of a company called Toyota. And it just didn't exist. Everything was made in America. So the reason I'm telling you all this historically is this was the very beginning of the pinch that a lot of the Rust Belt companies felt. Manufacturing companies, steel companies, iron ore companies, right? We're starting to feel those very early pinchings of international competition. Before ERISA, when you funded your employees' pension, you guys all worked for me, say I was John Deere, right? And I had 50,000 employees in the Midwest. I grew up in Sioux Falls. Everybody either worked for the prison, the meatpacking plant, or John Deere, right? One of the three. So if you guys all worked for me in John Deere, and I was planning I have a pension plan for you, every month I would get out my checkbook and I would write a check for $2 million, and it would go out of my checking account and into another account called pension. And then when you retired, I would cut you a check for the rest of your life. And that's really how pensions worked in probably most of your grandparents, but for me, my parents' age, right? Era, right? And you worked for one or two companies, And that was it. You got your pension check from John Deere once a month forever. They started raiding these pension accounts, and some of them became insolvent. So now you've worked for a company your whole life, right? And I bet, did any of you have grandparents that worked for like one or two companies his or her whole life? You know what your grandparents did? Were they farmers? Were they workers? Were they what they do?
Small business owners, so
Small business owner,
Plumber.
plumber, okay. What else?
Nurse.
Sorry?
Nurse.
Nurse, okay, oh cool. Most I guess grandmothers in your era have been either nurses or teachers, right? So they started raiding the pension accounts, and they became insolvent, and there was a lot of pressure on Congress to fix it, and ERISA quote unquote fixed it. Although if you follow news, you can see our pension system is still pretty broke. But at any rate, it did two things. Okay, that's all in that first bullet. So what it says is two things. First off, you can't just put it in another account that you have control over. You have to send it to a trustee. That's what that first blue bullet says. The trustee must monitor the pension plan. Okay? That means that it has to go like to a trust agency or an attorney or a bank or a fiduciary, somebody else. When I write that check for $2 million, it has to go to somewhere else and I can't touch it. That's one thing. And then the second thing it says is that your people have to vest. They have to start vesting within 3 years and finish within 6. And this bears a little bit of explaining. So does anybody know what vesting is? You ever heard the term? You're vested in your plan. It doesn't mean you're participating. It means you get to take the money when you leave. But you always get your own money. We're talking about the money the employer put in and the income generated on the money the employer put in. Does that make sense? So when you fund a pension and this has changed significantly. So what I was kind of describing like in the 70s, the 50s and 60s and the 70s, the employees never put in back then, did they? It was all employer provided. Can you imagine that? Most of us in here now are going to be the primary funders of our own retirement plan, aren't we? And particularly with Social Security, for some of you that are young, there's a good chance you'll pay into it your whole lives, and won't be there when you get there, or it'll look very different than it does now. Okay. But so basically what happens, right, in a pension or a retirement fund is, in this day and age, the employee is the primary funder, right? So this whole concept of vesting doesn't apply to this chunk of money. That's always yours. And when you put money in, it's going to generate income, right? Like interest or dividends or appreciations or some combination thereof. That's always yours. What we're talking about here is this piece. The money that the employer puts in. And hopefully when you go to work with your first job and you get you look at your retirement plan document, there'll be a match. So if I put in $1, my employer puts in 50 cents. I put in $1, my employer puts in $1 and caps it at 3% of my compensation. I put in $1, my employer puts in a dime. Okay? And rule of thumb is you always, always, always maximize that because you're just leaving money on the table. If I can put in up to $5,000 a year and my employer's going to give me $2,500 to go with that, of course I'm going to do whatever it takes to put in that $5,000. Otherwise, I'm leaving $2,500 on the table, right? So what this says, this is just a sample vesting plan. It's not a mandatory one. But what ERISA says is you have to start vesting within 3 years in this. And you have to be 100% vested in 6 years. So I may set up in my company, after 2 years, you're 20% vested. And after 3 years, you're 40% vested. I can do whatever I want. as long as you start vesting in 3 years and you're 100% vested in 6.
What is the 100% vested though? Like,
That means you get it all.
depending on the number. Oh, just
You get all this. Sorry, yeah, I didn't make that clear. So if I'm 20% vested in this plan, and I leave after I've been with you for 2.5 years, you're my employer, you've got to cut me a check for all of my money, all of the income on my money, and 20% of this. So it's a retaining tool, isn't it? So you've got, as an employer, you've got to walk a really fine line. I don't want, so there's two things. I want to write the plan so that you stay, right? I want you to stay. And obviously, if I give you 100% in 1 year, you can walk out the door. You don't have any, that's not a tool to keep you. So that's one piece of it. But then the other piece of it is, like in highly competitive markets, young people, particularly like, say in LA or Silicon Valley or now like Boise, I mean, real hotbeds of high-tech growth and a lot of young, highly skilled people and highly sought-after young people. They want 100% vesting day one. They won't even look at you if you don't have 100% vesting day one, because the assumption is everyone's highly mobile in that world. So do you see what I'm saying? So you as the employer, you've got to be crafty about how you write this and what your goals are, because it's a retention tool. But you also don't want to scare off prospective talent by having a back-end loaded vesting plan. Does that make sense?
So I have a question.
Go ahead.
So if you're 100% vested, that is based on how much you're contributing as an employee?
Nope.
Or
Employer. You always from day one say, so
it's
here's,
just about time spent in the job?
it's about time spent in the job.
Okay. I was just confused there. All right.
From day one, I start a new job in radio broadcasting, and I put away, my employer's like, I'll match you dollar for dollar up to 3% of your compensation a year. So I do the calculation, I'm making $100,000 a year, I can put in $3,000. So I'm like, cool, I'm going to put in $3,000, Cumulus Media is going to match me $3,000. So I work for 3 months and I put in my, whatever that ends up being, $750, and they put in $750, and I'm like, this place sucks, I'm out of here. I take my $750 plus the 26 cents I've earned on it.
Mm-hmm.
If it's 100% vesting immediately, I also take their money with me.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's a really important thing to ask when you look at your retirement plan. And a lot of people with their first job, they're just like, oh, I've got health insurance, or oh, I've got a retirement plan. It's like, that means nothing unless you look at the document, right? Because if you've got a plan that has no employer match, there's nothing you really gain that you couldn't get off of an IRA other than maybe a little bit of a higher cap. See what I mean? So, or I've got health insurance with a $10,000 deductible and a really, really limited network of providers. Well, wowee. And you pay your own premiums, you really have nothing. So it's all about looking at the plan documents, and we'll spend some time doing that this semester. Okay, ACA. ACA, obviously also called Obamacare. As we go to press, the ACA faces an uncertain future. As you can imagine, the current administration has been trying to roll back ACA and has been successful eating at bits and pieces of it. It still is a piece of legislation that exists, but it's been sliced and diced. The Supreme Court's upheld it twice, so that's great. But a core piece of it was carved out last year, which was the mandatory coverage. And that was really kind of the guts of it. There's a lot of things under ACA that are very, very popular, so I don't think it'll ever become completely gutted. For example, anybody know what a couple of the very first things were that rolled out? It was an incremental piece of legislation, right?
The pre-existing condition.
Yes, you can't deny someone coverage for pre-existing condition. Prior to ACA, if I was an insurance company and I'm like, oh, I'm sorry, you're a diabetic, I'm not going to cover you. I mean, and again, for a lot of you that are young, you can hardly imagine this, but I mean, prior to 2008, when Obama, well, it didn't pass till 2010, when Obama signed this into law, insurance companies could just not cover people like, oh, you've had breast cancer, that sucks. And you couldn't get coverage. So it locked you into staying at a job with a certain carrier for your life, essentially. So pre-existing condition, it also probably impacts a lot of you younger folks. It allows you to stay on your parents until you're 26. Used to be 24. Recognizing that a lot of people need those couple extra years to get established on their own. It took, go ahead.
So, did you have to be enrolled in like school or anything because you carried until 26?
No. Just a young adult that has not reached the age of 26.
Cool.
It got rid of the lifetime limit, which is something I hope none of you ever need to know anything about. But prior to Obamacare, you would oftentimes, insurance would have a lifetime limit of $1 million, which sounds like a lot of money. But take your kiddo over to Seattle for cancer care for 6 months, and you have hit $1 million like that. And then you're just bankrupt. Your house is gone, all your assets are gone, and there goes your life. So that was eliminated. It set up exchanges that have maybe not worked as great as we had all hoped, which was trying to cause insurance companies to compete for your business. It requires employers of 50 or more people to provide some sort of plan. It subsidizes your premiums if you're low income, but not so low income that you're on Medicare, or Medicaid, excuse me. Medicare. Huh?
It's Medicaid.
Medicaid.
It's for disability and then.
Yeah, gosh, I should so know this. Yeah, so if you're on Medicaid, you're at 400% or less of the federal poverty level. If you're low income but above that 400% FPL, federal poverty level, then you can get subsidies to pay your own premiums, and that comes through your tax return. Okay. What else is on here that's important? It's super complicated. I have a tax practice. I have 50 tax clients that I do taxes for, and the first couple years that this came out, I will tell you that tax returns were taking me an average of 90 minutes longer to process. I mean, you're getting 1095As and 1095Bs and 1095Cs, and oh my God, people were getting penalties because they hadn't had health insurance, and trying to explain to somebody that always got a refund that now you owe $600 this year, and I mean, it was a little crazy. I think about the time we were all getting used to it, Trump got elected, and how it started to roll back. So a lot of the things that I think we were just kind of getting used to as tax preparers. So we'll see what happens. I don't think it'll ever be rolled back completely without something to replace it. I don't think that will happen, but stay tuned. Nobody keeps me in the loop. Okay, other state laws, I'm not going to talk a whole ton about this, but workers' comp, everyone's aware that every state has to have workers' comp, right? Workers' compensation. They can never make you pay for it. It's always employer paid. And this is kind of a mouthful, but it's statutorily equivalent, meaning it's got to cover the same kinds of things in Idaho and Iowa and Alabama and Alaska. It's statutorily mandated. So I can't say, well, in Montana, we don't compensate you if you lose your leg. It's like, does that just go off when I don't touch it for a while? Yeah, so like every law, like if you lose a pinky fingertip, it's worth $5,000. If you use the little whole finger, it's $10,000. If you lose your whole hand, it's $20,000. Arm below the elbow is $25,000, etc., etc. And that's statutorily similar. Not to be morbid, but and your thumb's worth a whole bunch more than your other fingers. There's different premiums based upon job classes, so like they don't probably pay barely anything on me because how am I going to hurt myself on the job other than like trip over a cord or something? But like I have or had a client that was a log liner, and he paid 50 cents on the dollar to every dollar he paid his guys that were out in the woods log lining. So, high risk job, and he had a horrible safety record too. I don't think he's in business anymore. He is creepy. That's a total aside to him not being a safe shop. He was just a creepy guy. State disability, we don't have it in Montana, but this is if you're disabled for something that didn't occur on the job. So I'm driving home from work, I get in a horrific car accident, and I can't work anymore. Who pays my bills if I don't have disability insurance? Yeah. This is, you'll hear this from me 1,000 times this semester, this is a preliminary pitch to every single person in this room should have disability insurance, unless you have somebody that magically can pick up your bills if something happens. It costs like $9 a month. It's nothing. Disability insurance. It covers up to 67% of your gross wages. So if I'm in this horrific car accident and I can't work for the next year, I get a check every week for 67% of what I make now. And you don't pay tax on it, so it's really the same thing.
Anyone can do it?
Anybody can do it. I mean, I buy mine through work. My husband buys his personally. Anybody can buy it. It's at Aflac. That little Aflac. Some states have it. Again, more liberally leaning states. Comes from tax base, and if you're injured, you get a check from the state. But we do not have it in Montana. That's never going to happen with our conservative legislature. So if you want disability insurance, you better buy it. It's really important.
So that's through a third party?
That's just through a private insurer. Aflac and Unum, UNUM, are the two big providers. And it's really an inconsequential amount of money that you hope you never have to use. But believe me, if you do need it someday, you are going to be dang happy you wrote that check every month. And then the last couple slides are on how HR and payroll interact. A lot of people think those are sort of analogous terms. They're not. HR has grown actually so complex. It's now generally a senior report to the COO or the CEO of a company. HR used to be kind of buried, like, oh, the cute little lady in the corner office that, does all the paperwork for hiring. It is an incredibly litigious area. There's a lot of legalities around it. It's complex. You've got to comply with local law, state law, federal law, immigration law. And so it's right up there with, marketing and research and development and product launch and sales, and really, really important area. Payroll feeds into it, but it's generally not under it. Payroll is generally in finance and accounting. Okay. Oh, what does this say? Payroll department performs accounting functions, can be under the direct control of the CFO, although the trend is to place it under direction of HR. Yeah, I can tell you don't see that in Missoula, Montana. That may be happening in major markets. I don't know. The thing is, the CFO is always responsible for payroll and payroll compliance, so I would never let payroll move out from underneath me. If I was CFO, if I was responsible for something and it was housed in another department, that would not fly for me, but maybe that is the trend in other markets. Okay, so HR, they've got really 5 tasks. Okay, somebody puts in marketing, says we need a new social media marketing assistant, right? So you've got to write a job description. You've got to make sure that's compliant. You've got to recruit for the position, get as many candidates as you can. Then you're going to select them. You've got to, again, comply with a score of laws. Almost anything you're going to go to now, unless it's a really small business, you're probably going to have a panel interview, because you don't want to, for legal reasons, just rely on a one-on-one interview, because then there's too much subjectivity potential. I just didn't like her. He smelled funny, I didn't like her color hair, right? So you get around that by having a panel and some sort of matrix that everybody's filling out. Qualifications, aptitude, team building skills, so that when I don't hire you and you come back and you sue me for discrimination because you're Korean American, I can be like, it's not because he was Korean American, it's because here was his score, and 3 people scored him this way, and that was less than the other 2 candidates, right? So it's really, really critical. You have to have tight policies around this because we are a very sue-happy country. So then I've hired somebody, now I've got to orient them to my company. Got to have some sort of manual in place. You've got to have some sort of training in place. You want them to sign for everything that they've learned because you don't want them to come back in 6 months and go, they didn't train me for success. I was set up to fail. Now I'm going to sue you. It's endless. So make sure you've got a good training program, orienting, training. And then ultimately, believe me, it is not easy to get rid of somebody anymore. It's not just like, oh, sorry, you're not working out. You should probably have a whole series of processes that you've gone through where you've warned them and you've given them a chance to remediate and, trained them in what they could do better and da-da-da-da-da, shy of like going and knocking on their door and getting them to work on time. And then maybe you can get to the point where you've documented it thoroughly enough where you can terminate somebody. Pre-hire inquiries, that's kind of a big deal. What's the problem with that? So, say Sierra's applying for a job, her potential employer, this actually just literally happened to me last Wednesday or Thursday. I get a call from a gal that I know very well. She directs HR at one of the big CPA firms here in Missoula. They've taken a ton of my students over the last 25 years. And, I mean, I kind of couldn't believe she did this because she knew what I was going to say. She calls, she's got so-and-so's resume sitting here, tell me how she was in the classroom, what kind of grades did she get, did she show up, what can I say? Nothing. Yes, she was a student, 2017 through 2019. Yes, she did take my income tax class. Yes, she was in payroll. Yeah. I can't disclose anything about her. It's a completely obsolete part of the hiring process. Because the minute I say so not the sharpest knife in the drawer, great gal, but never really got the technique down on the tax software, and she doesn't get the job, you know what she's going to do? She's going to come back and sue the university. Right? So once a semester we have the chief counsel from Main Hall comes over, and we all have to sit and listen to don't inappropriately touch your students. Don't ever give away any sort of, data about them. And it's like, okay, thank you for the heads up. But I mean, because it happens, you just can't. So, and that's the same with trying to get that from an ex-employer. You really can't say anything anymore. Even if when you leave, I'm like, here, sign this, Shiley, that says that I have the right to talk to subsequent employers about you. Even if I have you sign that waiver, I wouldn't do it. So those are just kind of obsolete in my opinion. You can do background checks. I can test you aptitude-wise or psychologically, but only if it's relevant. So like when my husband hires, he's CFO of the youth homes, when he hires for his accounting department, and you come in and you're like, oh, I'm a whiz on QuickBooks and I love Excel. And then he's like, write a formula and drag it over. And someone's sitting there like, So he can do that. But he can't be like, he can't ask you to do something that's not directly related to what you're going to be doing on site. But he can, he can test your skills. I'm sure you've all had aptitude tests or psychology tests online where you've got to go and answer all the questions, and they're worded in a million different ways so that, it's supposed to make sure you're not, fabricating your answers. Have you guys all had those? Yeah. They're irritating. They take so freaking long. If you're in a room alone with a cat, it's like, oh. I'd pet it? I don't know. What would I do? Okay, background checks. Drug testing. Drug testing is different state by state. Okay? And so you've got to be, if you're an employer in multiple states, you should be, again, conversant. This is where HR gets complicated. You don't want to violate anybody's statutory rights by improper drug testing. Okay, second bullet, lots of companies now will have formal job offers, and keep all of your applications for 1 year, keep all of your interviewing notes for a year, so if somebody comes back and says they were discriminated against, you can show that they weren't. And then that's about that. Yes, ma'am. Oh, you're just stretching. Okay. And then the last two things, and then we're done with this unit. And these are going to be two things that we're working on. I talked about this payroll register. Did anybody make a decision on the ebook? Do I need to get? You did? Anybody else?
Can I just get a copy?
Okay.
I'm renting mine, and I'm not sure if it's actually.
Oh, yeah, no, it's not. It's not going to be in there.
I figured.
Okay, let me. Does anybody have a sticky note? Huh? Do you have a sticky note? This is a rental?
Yes.
I know, but they're all new, you can only buy them.
Uh-huh.
So they have them, and I don't know if we can use
I can't imagine that you can rent. Well, so what's the difference between renting and buying a book if you can rip stuff out of it?
At the end of the semester.
One more
So you
time.
actually pay half the price.
Okay. Oh, no, I mean, I understand the price difference, but why wouldn't everybody in the whole world always rent?
I know it.
Unless you're like, I want to read this book for the next 5 years.
The only reason is like if it has a supplement that you have to get with like a package. You know?
Uh-huh.
But other than
And
that,
what was the differential on the price in this?
I don't know if it's exactly half, but it's close.
Well, the ebook was like 70 that I got, and then to like even rent the paper book was like 140.
I put the whole thing all together, it was like $227 if we bought it. So this?
Yeah.
Pricey. Right. So it was a big savings.
Yeah,
It was worth it.
yeah.
But you just can't write it.
No, you can't.
So what, I don't get it. The only difference is if you foresee yourself using the book, wanting the book in your own library.
Which they said as long as like you don't mess up like this
The binding.
spine or
Uh-huh.
anything like that, the bleed can come back and it's fine.
Which I was gonna ask your
So you can
opinion
write
on.
and everything.
Huh?
I was gonna ask your opinion on that. Like, is this something that you could foresee people, like for instance me, needing to reference or anything, or do you think it would be okay?
It changes so fast, Lisa.
So,
Payroll law
we can
changes
return
so
this on the
fast.
website.
The thing is, though, that you guys all have to be aware of, but there's no problem working around this, is we're going to be using forms and stuff out of here, but all the forms that you could either just copy them and use them, or you can just print them from irs.gov. So, I mean, yeah, we'll just work around it. Okay, so can I see a show of hands who wants the... Okay.
Thank you.
So this is one of the things, this is our point of original entry, where we enter all the names, how much people earned, all their deductions, and their net pay. And once you do that, then you move it all to individual employees' earnings records, and that keeps a cumulative of each person, so that at the end of the year you can cut W-2s, and at the end of each quarter you can do quarterly reports. In the old days, we honestly did all this person by person, item by item, over and over and over and over the same numbers. Kind of astounding. So obviously this is all computerized now, but I want you to see it so you understand what's going on.
Okay, that was basically my question. So is this sort of just for like learning purposes,
It's
but nowadays you would be entering it into like QuickBooks or something?
Although with that said, I have my very first tax client every year. They have a small tech company, and her husband does the tech work and she does the bookkeeping. She's so cute. She brings me a journal, an old-fashioned journal like I learned on in the 1980s, and she keeps her payroll like this. I mean, her husband and she are the only employees, and it's very sweet. And I take copies of it and highlight it, and so yeah, I mean, some people still do that. She's
That's
the only
how some
person.
people work though, they work better.
Yeah, yeah.
Like that.
Yeah, totally. So, okay, that is the culmination of this unit. Oh, this just basically says, and this is actually a true statement, that a lot of small and mid-sized companies are now outsourcing their payroll because it's so freaking complicated. So, I'm going to pay you $40 per employee per month, and you're responsible for everything, cutting the checks, running the reports, dealing with the, with the compliance agencies, da-da-da-da-da. So that happens more and more.
It's actually not even that expensive.
It's not that expensive? Like, how much is it a month?
I mean, I guess for us, we fluctuate a lot with how many people we have working, but I want to say like every quarter, it's probably $200
For
for 3 months.
For like 5 employees?
Yeah. Well, and including us, because we're on our own payroll, so.
So maybe,
And it all goes direct deposit, so there isn't even check writing or.
right, so maybe $15 a person a month,
Yeah.
there's tops. Okay, or less than that
Yeah, I
even.
think it's less. It's not much.
One thing that's kind of controversial about it is, and this is also controversial with income tax processing, is all of that payroll data is streamed to Bangalore, India. They're not processed here in America. So you've got all your payroll data going to Bangalore and back. Some people don't like that. It's just kind of the reality of how things work. Okay, so I'm going to just show you this really quickly. This is going to be our first glance. We're going to look at it again a number of times, but it's under that very first area called announcements and miscellaneous documents. And it's the employee and employer payroll taxes and caps. And if I were you, I would print it out and put it in a plastic pocket or the inside of your book or whatever you want to do to make it easy to reference, because none of this is intuitive and you just have to know it. So there's 4 employee taxes and 4 employer taxes. And if you've had a paycheck, you've seen all 4 of these employee taxes come out of your check. They might look a little different on your names. So if you recall, OASDI is a fancy name for what? Old age survivors and disability insurance, and it's Social Security. It's just a fancy word for Social Security. But you need to know what OASDI stands for, because that's actually technically what it's called. Okay? Social Security, you pay 6.2% of every dollar you make up until you reach a cap. And the cap changes every year, and this year it's $132.9.
Does it go up every year?
Every year. When I first started teaching, it's like $60,000 a year. So if you're one of those lucky people that make over $132.9, you will see your tax bill go down when you hit it, because you're no longer paying OASDI.
At all, it goes to 0.
It goes to 0. It's all done. Your employer matches that. So for every dollar you earn, really 12.4 cents cumulatively goes into the Social Security system for you. Yeah, wow. It's a lot.
The rates changed a little bit.
The rates have not changed in 40 years. The cap is what changes. HI or Medicare is an employee tax and is also matched by an employer. It is 1.45%. And if you make $20 million a year, you pay 1.45% of the entire $20 million. There's no cap. There's an add-on tax that came as part of ACA. Obviously, ACA costs money. How are we going to fund all this? One of the taxes was on Medicare. And if you make $200,000 or more a year, you pay an additional 0.9% on the amount over $200,000. So effectively, your Medicare goes up to 2.35. I honestly have no sympathy for people that whine. You're making freaking $200,000 a year.
Is it just for the employee, right?
It's just for the employee. The employer doesn't match that additional 0.9. The other 2 taxes that employees pay are FIT and SIP, federal income tax and state income tax. And here's the rates. Federal income tax, our lowest bracket's 10, our highest bracket's 37, and there's 6 brackets. SIP In Montana, lowest bracket's 1%, highest bracket's 6.6.
Not based on the state.
It's based on the state. Some states don't have it at all. Those 4 taxes are going to come out of your check. Okay? These are the 4 taxes the employer pays. Dollar for dollar, they match you on OASDI and HI, except for that 0.9. Then they also pay FUTA and SUTA, federal unemployment and state unemployment. FUTA is a tiny tax, 0.6%, up to $7,000. So it's $42 a year if I pay you more than $7,000. SUTA is dependent upon what kind of employment record I have. So if I've had the same 20 people working for me forever, I'm going to have a nice little SUTA rate. If I churn through people, I'm going to have a high SUTA rate because a lot of unemployment's been claimed on me. Okay. And the cap changes every year. This year it is $34,100. So that could be quite expensive. If you've got a 5% SUTA up to $34,100, I could easily be paying $1,500 per person per year. So believe me, managing your SUTA rate is really important. That's a big cost. I would be prepared next week to be able to regurgitate this for me. Because this is just the basis of everything we're doing. You should also, over the weekend, do your Chapter 1 homework out of the syllabus for Tuesday. And you should also be prepared for next well, that's not next week. A week from Tuesday, we'll have a quiz on all of our acronyms. FMLA, IRCA, ERISA, PBGC. So just start kind of wrapping your head around those. Okay.
Tuesday the,
28th. Yeah, it might even get pushed to the 30th. Sometime that week, Sherry. Sometime that week, either the 28th or the 30th. So, Chapter 1 homework for Tuesday the 21st. I'll either see you in 10 minutes or not until next week. I have a bunch of you back-to-back classes. And happy Martin Luther King Day. Do something kind. Make the world a better place. I will have this lecture posted if you want to hear anything again.